This happened a year ago, but I still can't sleep most nights. When I do manage to close my eyes, I see his face. I see those eyes, wide and wild, staring through me. My wife tells me it's over. The cameras, the alarms, they should make me feel safe. But they don't. Nothing does. I used to manage a regional branch for a mid-sized company. It was the kind of job where you dealt with too much paperwork and too many people. Most employees came and went without leaving a trace. But Dave was different. He was the one I'll never forget. Dave worked in our warehouse. He was trouble from the start, always pushing boundaries, ignoring safety rules, and snapping at coworkers. He made people uncomfortable, but it was hard to put your finger on why. Then the petty theft started. Missing cash, stolen office supplies, even a coworker's phone. HR investigated and everything pointed to Dave. When they fired him, I was in the room. He barely said a word as they went through the paperwork, but when security came to escort him out, he stopped in the doorway. He looked at me and said, "You'll regret this." His voice was flat, calm. That was the part that stuck with me. At the time, I dismissed it as an empty threat. People say stupid things when they're angry. I forgot about him until 6 months later. It was a Friday night. My wife and I were at home with our 2 kids. She was in the kitchen making dinner. I was helping our daughter with her math homework, while my son was upstairs playing video games. It was a quiet evening, the kind you don't think twice about. Around 8:30 p.m., my wife called from the kitchen. She asked if I had left the garage door open. I hadn't. I walked to the door leading to the garage and checked. It was locked. The light was off and everything seemed normal. I hit the button to close the garage door, figuring it must have been a mistake. An hour later, my son came downstairs. He looked pale and nervous. He asked if someone was walking in the backyard. My stomach turned. Our backyard was fenced in, with no easy way to get inside. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out onto the patio, telling my wife to stay with the kids. The night was quiet. Too quiet. The flashlight cut through the darkness, sweeping across the lawn. Nothing. The gate was locked, just as I had left it. I stayed out there longer than I needed to, my eyes darting to every shadow. Eventually, I convinced myself I was overreacting. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. Before bed, I checked the house. Every window, every door, every lock. My wife teased me about being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling. Something was wrong. At 3:14 a.m., I woke up to the sound of shattering glass. My heart jumped into my throat as I reached under the bed and grabbed the baseball bat I kept there. My wife was already dialing 911. I told her to stay in the bedroom with the kids. The air downstairs felt colder. The sliding glass door was shattered, shards of glass glittering on the floor. Standing in the middle of my kitchen was Dave. He looked worse than I remembered. His hair was matted, his clothes were filthy, and his face was pale and gaunt, but his eyes were alive, wide, bloodshot, and filled with something I can only describe as madness. "I told you you'd regret it," he said. His voice was calm, almost casual, like he was talking about the weather. He was holding a crowbar. For a moment, I froze. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then he lunged. I swung the bat as hard as I could. The crack of wood against bone was deafening, and he dropped the crowbar, but he didn't stop. He tackled me, knocking the bat from my hands. His hands were everywhere, grabbing, clawing, punching. I felt his nails dig into my neck, his breath hot and sour against my face. I managed to shove him off and scrambled for the crowbar. The next part is a blur. I swung the crowbar with everything I had. He screamed, but I didn't stop. I swung again and again until he stopped moving. Blood pooled on the tile. My hands were trembling, my chest heaving. The police arrived minutes later, guns drawn. They found Dave alive, but barely conscious. In his car, they discovered a notebook. It was filled with pages of notes about my family, our schedules, our habits, even hand-drawn maps of our house. He had been watching us for weeks, maybe months. Dave survived, and he's in prison now. They told me he'll be there for a long time, but it doesn't feel like enough. The locks, the cameras, the alarms, they don't stop the nightmares. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow outside the window. I wonder if it's him, or if it's someone worse. I don't think I'll ever feel safe again. It was supposed to be a normal night. My wife and I had just gotten back from a quick dinner out. Nothing fancy, just a break from cooking after a long week. The kids were at a friend's house for the night, so we had the house to ourselves. We pulled into the driveway around 9:30 p.m. The rain earlier had left the pavement slick, and the air smelled damp and cold, like everything had been washed clean, but nothing was quite right. I remember noticing something odd. The back porch light was off. We always leave it on if we're going to be out past dark. "Did you turn it off?" I asked my wife as we got out of the car. She shook her head, her brow furrowing. "No," she said, but we didn't think much of it. Maybe the bulb had burned out. The moment we stepped inside, I felt it. That gut instinct you can't quite explain. Something was wrong. The house was too quiet. It was still. My heart seemed to drop just a little, and I glanced at the alarm panel by the door. It was disarmed. "Weird," I muttered, staring at the screen. "What's wrong?" my wife asked, a hint of concern in her voice. I swallowed. "Stay here." I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by the garage door. I had no real reason for it, other than the fact that it was there. This kind of thing didn't happen in our neighborhood. But even as I tried to convince myself of that, my mind was racing. I started up the stairs. My footsteps were too loud. They felt wrong, like they were betraying me. But I didn't stop. And then I heard it. A faint shuffle from upstairs. Someone was in the house. My heart slammed against my ribs. "Call 911, I whispered over my shoulder to my wife. She nodded, her face pale, her hand shaking as she reached for her phone. The sound came from our bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and light spilled into the hallway, soft and warm, so out of place. I crept forward, each step deliberate, my breath shallow. I didn't know what I was walking into, but I wasn't about to let whoever it was get away. Not in my house. I pushed the door open, and everything in my body went still. There was a man crouched by our closet, his back to me, a mess of tools scattered around him, and the safe wide open. My blood ran cold. He froze too, his eyes locked on mine, wide with panic, like a deer caught in headlights. He wasn't holding a weapon, but the moment I saw the safe, I didn't care. I couldn't care. "Who the hell are you?" I shouted, gripping the bat tighter. He stood slowly, hands raised in surrender. He stammered something, but it didn't register. My mind was too focused on the mess in my bedroom, the safe open, the violation. I swung. He dodged the first hit, stumbling backward into the bathroom, but the second one landed hard on his shoulder. He gasped, and I followed him into the small room, my breath ragged, my mind a blur of adrenaline. I didn't stop. I couldn't. He had invaded my space. He had come into my home. "Stop, Please." His voice cracked. I didn't stop. I swung again. His body collapsed, crumpling to the floor. The bat connected with his thigh, and I felt it. Felt the resistance, the sickening sound of bone meeting metal. He screamed, his hands clawing at the door frame, trying to pull himself up, but he couldn't. He was a mess of pain and desperation, and I didn't care. He made it to the stairs, crawling more than walking, his face pale and slick with sweat. I was right behind him, shouting at my wife to stay back, to stay safe. But part of me wasn't sure if I was trying to protect her or myself. The man tried to stand, his legs shaking. I swung again. This time, the bat hit him in the back just as he was halfway up the stairs, and he tumbled, his body flailing, crashing into the floor with a sickening thud. He didn't make a sound after that. I stood there for a moment, bat in hand, panting, my heartbeat loud in my ears. I stared at the crumpled body at the bottom of the stairs, my mind trying to catch up with what had just happened. It wasn't until the police arrived that I moved. They took him away, handcuffing him in the backyard, his face pressed into the mud. He didn't fight back. The officers told me I'd done the right thing, that I'd protected my family. But I didn't feel like a hero. I didn't feel anything. I sat in the kitchen, my hands shaking, staring at the spot on the floor where he had fallen. The silence in the house was deafening, the absence of noise a constant reminder of what I had just done. Hours passed. The kids came home, safe and unaware. My wife went to sleep beside me, but I stayed up, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts swirling. It wasn't until later, when I was alone, that I realized something. I had looked into that man's eyes. I had seen his fear. Real, human fear. He wasn't a monster. He wasn't a criminal mastermind. He was a desperate man who had made a terrible decision. And I had beaten him. I still wake up sometimes, in the middle of the night, heart racing, feeling the weight of that bat in my hands. I hear the sound of it hitting him, the way he begged, the look in his eyes. I tell myself it was justified, that I was protecting my family, my home. But part of me wonders if I crossed a line that night. A line I can never uncross. I woke up suddenly, the kind of jolt that makes your heart leap into your throat. There was no clear reason, no noise, nothing that should have woken me. But the feeling, it was like something was wrong. Like the air itself had shifted, thick with dread. It wasn't something I could ignore, no matter how much I tried. The panic settled deep in my gut, gnawing at me, relentless. I glanced at the clock on my nightstand. 3:12 a.m. Too early for anything good to happen, but I could feel it. Something was off. The house was still, too still. My daughter's room was above mine, and I strained to hear anything that might have explained why my instincts were screaming at me. But the silence only grew heavier. I told myself it was just a dream, some leftover unease from a bad night. I closed my eyes, trying to force myself back to sleep. But then I heard it. A creak. It wasn't just the house settling. It was slow, deliberate, like someone was stepping cautiously on the stairs downstairs. My heart raced, and I sat up, listening hard. The house was old. Every step, every shift of the floorboards echoed, impossible to ignore. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be subtle. Another creak. Louder this time. Closer. My mind was racing. Was it a burglar? Maybe someone had broken in looking for money or something. My hand instinctively reached for the gun I kept in my nightstand. But then something stopped me. I couldn't risk it. What if it was someone I knew? What if it was someone I didn't want to hurt? My breath felt shallow as I climbed out of bed. I needed to check, but calling the police seemed like the right first move. I grabbed my phone, still unsure of what was happening, and stepped into the hallway. Then I froze. At the bottom of the stairs, a shadow moved. It wasn't just a trick of the light. I wasn't imagining it. It was there. My blood ran cold. My ex. The thought barely registered before my instincts kicked in. My hands shook, the phone slipping in my grip, but I dialed 911 anyway, my voice a strained whisper when the operator picked up. My ex. He's here. He's inside. He's trying to take my daughter. I didn't wait for a response. I knew they would send someone, but that could take too long. I didn't have much time. I heard the sliding glass door to the backyard creak open. I knew it was him. He always knew how to sneak in, how to get inside without being seen. He was here, in my house. I was frozen, my heart pounding too loud to think. "You think you can just take her from me?" His voice was low, raspy, seething with rage. It sent a shiver down my spine. I wanted to scream, but my body wouldn't obey. I couldn't think, couldn't process what was happening. But I knew one thing. He wasn't leaving without her. I moved quickly, trying to be as quiet as possible as I padded down the hallway. I reached the stairs, and I could hear my daughter breathing softly from her room. She was still asleep, oblivious to the danger that was in the house with us. I reached her door and paused. I didn't know what he had planned, but I had to stop him. I had to keep him away from her no matter what. I touched the handle, but then, "I know you're up there." His voice, sharp and menacing, echoed up the stairs. It sent a jolt of terror straight through me. "I'm coming for you," he called, his voice more controlled now. "Open the door." I had to think fast. I couldn't let him get to her. My legs felt like lead as I stepped into her room, my mind racing. I locked the door behind me, pressing my back against it, my chest heaving. "Sweetheart, listen to me." I tried to keep my voice steady, but I was shaking. "Daddy's downstairs. You need to stay in here, no matter what, okay?" She blinked, confused, her little eyes still heavy with sleep. "What's happening, Mommy?" Her voice was soft, a whisper that only made the terror grow inside me. "Just stay in here, baby. Don't open the door for anyone, not even me. Understand?" She nodded, still too scared to ask any more questions. I could hear him pounding down the hallway now. His footsteps were heavy, almost triumphant. "I'm coming for you," he called again. His voice was calm, but there was something in it, something dangerous, like he was savoring the moment. I backed away from the door, trying to steady my breath. My thoughts were scattered. How had he found a way in? Why was he doing this now? Then I heard it. A loud crash. The front door. He had found it. He was inside. I grabbed my phone again, but my hands were trembling so badly that I could barely unlock it. Finally, I hit the emergency button. 911. What is your emergency? My ex. He's here. He's trying to take my daughter. Please hurry. I didn't know how much time we had left. The operator's voice was calm, reassuring, but it did nothing to soothe the panic rising in my chest. "Officers are on their way," she said. But it felt like an eternity before I heard the sirens. Then all of a sudden, everything went silent. Too silent. I pressed my ear to the door, holding my breath. What was he doing? Where had he gone? The minutes dragged by, stretching into an endless, suffocating silence. Then I heard it. His voice. Low. Frustrated. "I'll be back," he said. His words slithered through the door like a threat. "You haven't seen the last of me."
I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just waited. The seconds seemed to stretch on forever. I couldn't risk making a sound. I heard the distant wail of sirens again, getting closer, but it felt like they would never arrive.
Finally, I heard the police. Their voices shouting, calling for him to come out. It was chaos for a few minutes, doors slamming, shouting, confusion. But the most important thing was this. My daughter was safe. The police arrested him that night. They told me it could have been much worse if I hadn't acted quickly, but I didn't feel relieved. I felt sick. The terror of what could have happened, of what almost happened, didn't go away. I still hear his voice sometimes, that low growl of anger, the threat lingering in the air even now. I can still feel the cold grip of panic when I think about that night. The fear hasn't left me. It haunts me, even in the quiet of my own home. It started a few months ago. David, my neighbor, had always been a bit off. We'd known each other for years, exchanging the usual pleasantries. "Hey, how's it going?" "Good weather, huh?" But there was always something strange in his eyes. He'd nod when I waved, but he never made much of an effort to talk. I didn't think much of it. I just chalked it up to him being private. But that was before this all happened. David's life had been rough for a while. I'd heard rumors, his son's medical bills, the struggle with insurance. People talked behind his back, but I didn't pay attention. Everyone has their problems, right? Hell, I had my own issues. But I should have noticed the signs. I should have seen it coming. One afternoon, I got a new shipment for my business. Some office supplies, nothing exciting. Just the usual stuff. Bills to pay, inventory to check, paperwork to sort through. My office was small, but the safe in the corner held everything I valued. Cash, documents, personal items. It's not a big safe, just a small wall model, but I never left it unlocked. I locked the safe that day, as I always did, and left to run errands. The day felt normal, but it had that strange undertone, the kind of feeling you get when something is slightly wrong, but you can't put your finger on it. David wasn't home when I left. At least I didn't think he was. When I got back a few hours later, something was off. I walked through the front door, arms full of groceries, and noticed immediately the lock on my office door was askew. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make my stomach twist. I thought maybe I'd forgotten to lock it myself, but when I stepped into the room, my blood went cold. The safe was open. I stood frozen for a moment, my heart thudding in my chest. I could see it. The dial had been turned. It wasn't how I left it. Someone had been inside. Panic started to claw at me, but I tried to steady myself. The room was just as I'd left it, except for one thing. I noticed that my spare key, the one I kept under the flower pot by the door, was gone. My stomach sank. I wasn't a paranoid person, but I knew something was wrong. I didn't want to believe it, but the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. The only person who knew about that spare key was David. But no, it couldn't be. David, my neighbor, the family man. But then I remembered how strange he'd been lately, always tired, distracted, like he wasn't all there. I didn't want to believe it, but I had to check. I opened the security camera footage on my phone and scanned through the footage. It was boring at first. Just me leaving the house, the usual cars driving by. But then I saw it. David. He was on my porch, fumbling with the key I kept under the flower pot. I leaned in, staring at the screen, my pulse picking up as I watched him unlock the door. He didn't look at the camera. His back was turned, but I could see the way he was moving, his hands shaking as he turned the key. He stepped inside. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced, my body frozen in place. David, the guy I'd known for years, the guy I'd shared beers with, had been in my house, my office. He had gone through my stuff. I had no idea what he had taken, or if he'd taken anything at all. But I knew that something was seriously wrong. And then it hit me. David had been here before, looking for something. I thought about confronting him then and there, but I stopped myself. What if he had taken something important? What if he knew something he shouldn't? What if he had seen something I couldn't afford for him to know? I didn't want to face him yet, not without more proof, not without knowing exactly what I was dealing with. I called the police, not to press charges, but to figure out what to do next. I wanted to be careful. This could all be a mistake, right? But the nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach told me it wasn't. I wasn't wrong. The days that followed were a blur. I went through the motions, pretending like everything was fine, but nothing felt fine. Every time I saw David outside, he avoided my gaze. It was subtle at first, but I could see the guilt in his eyes. The way he would glance over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to be watching him. His family seemed distant too, off in their own world. It was like they were hiding something. I kept waiting for the police to show up, but every day that passed felt like a countdown to something worse. Then, one afternoon, I saw him again. David was standing on his porch, talking to someone on the phone. His words were low, almost too quiet for me to hear. But it wasn't his words that made my skin crawl. It was the way he kept looking over his shoulder, like he was making sure no one was watching him. And then, in that moment, I saw it. The guilt in his eyes. He knew I knew. I couldn't take it anymore. I walked over, my heart pounding. I had to know. I had to confront him. "David," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "Did you take something from my house?" His eyes went wide. For a second, I thought he was going to deny it, to brush it off. But he didn't. He didn't say a word. He didn't apologize. He just stood there, staring at me with that look in his eyes, like a man on the verge of breaking. I could see the fear in him, the desperation. I thought I'd feel anger, but what I felt was something worse. Disappointment. I had trusted him. I had known him for years, and now, standing there in front of me, he was someone I didn't recognize. His silence spoke volumes, and it chilled me to the bone. I told him he had a choice: make things right or face the consequences. I don't know if he understood, but I knew he had no choice. He was cornered. He couldn't run, not anymore. But I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if I could trust him again. Weeks have passed since that confrontation. I still haven't pressed charges. Part of me wants to make him pay for violating my trust. But part of me feels sorry for him. He was only trying to fix a situation that spiraled out of control. But then I remember the look in his eyes, the guilt, the way he couldn't even look at me anymore. I'll never look at David the same way again. And I'll never look at my house the same way either. The feeling of someone being inside, of something being taken, even if I don't know what, sticks with me. Every creak in the floorboards, every rustle outside my window. I can't shake it. I never will. And that's the scariest part. A few months ago, I went to the grocery store. It was one of those days where you just want to get in, grab what you need, and get out. I don't remember much about him. He wasn't anything remarkable, but I remember the way he stood too close, just far enough to feel uncomfortable. I reached for the last carton of almond milk, and we made brief eye contact. He smiled at me. I smiled back, nothing out of the ordinary. But that's when it started. I saw him again, same store, same spot. It was like he was waiting for me. Then, I saw him across the street at the coffee shop. It wasn't a coincidence. I had been there every day that week, but he was always there too. At first, I brushed it off. I mean, who doesn't like coffee, right? But every time I looked up, I'd find him watching me a little too intently. It made my stomach twist. It started to feel like I was always aware of him. His presence would press in on me, even when I wasn't looking directly at him. I'd feel this strange tension in the air whenever I passed by him. The hairs on the back of my neck would prickle. But when I turned to look, he was always just far enough away to convince myself I was imagining it. But I wasn't. Every time I saw him, it felt like a piece of me was being chipped away. Then one night, I came home and found my front door slightly ajar. I couldn't remember if I'd locked it or not. Stress from work had been eating away at me, and I'd been distracted. Maybe I forgot. But the moment I stepped inside, something felt off. The air was too cold, too still, too quiet. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I'd left it unlocked. Maybe the wind had pushed it open. But that night, I couldn't sleep. The feeling that I was being watched was so thick, I could almost taste it. I tried to ignore it, but every creak of the house, every shadow, made my pulse race. I couldn't shake the sense that someone was in the house with me. The next morning, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I almost ignored it. I'd been getting a lot of spam calls lately, but something stopped me. I picked up the phone. His voice was calm, too calm, smooth, like he had practiced. "I've been watching you for a while now. I know you're lonely, and I'm here to help. You don't need to be scared. I'm your savior." I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. This couldn't be real. I didn't know this person. But then, his voice dropped lower, almost a whisper, and he said something that made my blood run cold. "I know you like almond milk," he said. "I saw you in the store last week. You were wearing that gray sweater. I love it." I hung up immediately. My hands were shaking. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. It was too late to ignore it. This wasn't some random coincidence anymore. It was real. Over the next few days, I started to notice small things, little changes around my house, a picture frame out of place, a drawer that wasn't fully closed. I thought I was losing my mind, but each time I saw these little details, I felt like he was there, watching me. I kept wondering if I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling. Every corner of my home felt off. One evening, I came home late from work, and my stomach dropped when I walked in the door. He was sitting on my couch. His eyes were wide, excited, too excited. I stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move. How had he gotten in? He smiled at me like we were old friends, like it was normal, like he'd been here 1,000 times before. "I've been following you for months," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "I know everything about you, your likes, your dislikes. I'm the only one who really understands you. I'm the only one who can help you." I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. I didn't know what to say. He wasn't threatening, not at first. His tone was almost comforting, like he was trying to reassure me. He kept repeating that I didn't need to be scared. He was here to save me. He said I was wasting my time with my life. He was the one who could make everything better. We were meant to be together. I wanted to throw up. I wanted to call the cops, but something about the way he looked at me made me hesitate. He wasn't violent, not yet. But the words he spoke were like poison, seeping into my brain, and the longer I stood there, the more his words made sense. Was I wasting my time? Then he said something that made me freeze in place. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "I have a key." My breath caught. I couldn't breathe. I looked down at the door. I always locked it. I hadn't been gone long enough for him to break in, but he had been inside. He didn't steal anything. He didn't touch a thing. He just watched me. He told me that I didn't need to be afraid. He wanted me to be happy. He was here to help. The police were no help. By the time they arrived, he was gone. No signs of forced entry, no evidence. Just me, sitting alone in my living room, terrified. My mind was racing, my heart still pounding. How could I prove any of this? Who would believe me? I changed the locks, installed cameras. I haven't been back to that store. I haven't gone near that coffee shop. But no matter how many locks I add, no matter how many cameras I install, I still feel it. Every time I leave the house, the feeling never goes away. That familiar weight on my chest, the constant dread that I'm being followed. Every time I glance over my shoulder, I swear I can see him. His face is always just out of sight, lurking in the shadows, waiting. It was a quiet night. I had just settled in after a long day, the soft hum of my ceiling fan the only sound in the room. My parents were out for the evening, and it was just me and my younger brother, who was asleep in the room down the hall. I was texting some friends, trying to distract myself from the creeping anxiety I always felt when home alone. The house was old, built in the 70s, and I'd always felt like it had a kind of presence. It was never anything too obvious, just a faint sense of being watched, especially when I was alone. But tonight, that feeling seemed stronger. The house creaked and groaned as it settled, but for some reason, it was louder tonight. Like the walls were trying to tell me something. I heard a noise. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. The wind was picking up outside, so it could have been anything. A branch tapping against the window or the house shifting on its foundation. But then it came again. A soft thud, almost like something falling. It came from downstairs, from the kitchen. My heart skipped. It could have been the house settling again, but something told me it wasn't. I grabbed my phone and quietly got out of bed, trying not to wake my brother. I checked my phone. Nothing new, no messages, nothing important. Another noise. This time it was louder. It was unmistakable. Someone was downstairs. I froze, listening. My thoughts were racing. Should I call the police? Should I wake my brother? My mind was a mess. I quietly moved to the top of the stairs, holding my breath, hoping whoever was down there hadn't heard me. I tried to peek down the stairs without making a sound, but the shadows down there were thick and suffocating. I couldn't see anything. The noise came again. This time, it was the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the creaky floorboards. Someone was definitely moving around. I backed away from the stairs, my mind spiraling. Maybe it was a neighbor, just messing around. But no one had a reason to be here. I was the only one at home. I grabbed my phone again, but my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't dial 911. I thought about waking my brother, but I couldn't let him get involved in whatever was happening. He was too young to understand. Suddenly, I heard the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor downstairs. The floorboards groaned under the weight, and the noise echoed through the house like a signal. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't stay up here any longer. I needed to get out. I crept back into my room, my heart pounding so loud I was sure the intruder could hear it. I shut my bedroom door as quietly as I could and locked it. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to think. What were they after? What did they want? I knew I needed to leave, but the only way out was through the stairs. The same stairs where I heard those footsteps. The same stairs that led to the dark, creepy kitchen. I heard the creak of my bedroom door. I felt it before I saw it. The door handle was slowly turning, the soft metal click echoing in the silent room. I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. My pulse was racing. Then, the door opened. I couldn't see the intruder at first, just the shadowy figure standing in the doorway. But the cold draft that filled the room told me that whoever it was standing right there, right next to me. I needed to act fast. I leapt out of bed and grabbed my phone, trying to get a signal. Nothing. I didn't have time to worry about that now. The figure in the doorway didn't move at first, as if it were waiting for me to make the first move. I could feel its eyes on me, though I couldn't see its face. The darkness of the room swallowed everything around me. With a burst of adrenaline, I grabbed my phone again, this time dialing 911. I whispered into the phone, barely able to hear the operator over the pounding of my heart. "There's someone in my house," I said, voice shaking. "Please help me." The operator told me to stay on the line, but just then, I heard something behind me. A soft sound. The floorboards creaked beneath a pair of heavy footsteps, moving closer. Closer. Too close. I turned around just in time to see a figure in the corner of my room, standing just behind me. They hadn't even made a sound when they moved. I screamed, a sharp, panicked cry. But before I could do anything, the person lunged at me. I threw my phone across the room as I tried to push them off, but they were too strong. The last thing I heard before everything went dark was the low, quiet voice of the intruder. "Don't scream." When I woke up, I was lying on the floor, my arms and legs bound with thick rope. My phone was shattered across the room, out of reach. My chest burned as I struggled to breathe, but I couldn't seem to focus. The darkness was suffocating, and I was still too disoriented to figure out what had happened. I heard footsteps downstairs, slow and deliberate. My heart pounded harder in my chest as I tried to keep still, too afraid to make a sound. My thoughts were a jumbled mess, but I knew I had to stay quiet. Whoever they were, I didn't want to make them any angrier. The door creaked open, and I saw a figure step into the room. I tensed, but the person didn't immediately approach me. I could barely make out their features, but I could tell they were watching me, assessing the situation. "We're not here to hurt you," one of them said, their voice low and calm. It felt like an odd reassurance, but I didn't believe it for a second. They stepped closer, and I froze. The other figure moved to my side, cutting the rope around my wrists without a word. For a second, I thought they might actually help me, but it didn't make sense. Why would they? "We're just taking your stuff," the first voice said again, almost apologetically. "We'll be gone before anyone notices." With that, I heard them turn and leave the room. The sounds of their footsteps slowly moved downstairs. Their presence was still felt, but I knew they were retreating. I stayed as still as I could, not daring to move until the house was completely silent. After a long time, I mustered the courage to move. I checked the door, but there was no one around. The quiet felt unnervingly strange. I didn't call the police right away. I sat on the floor trying to gather myself, the rope still frayed in my hands. When I finally did call, it was to report the break-in. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. They didn't care about the things they took. They were waiting for something, and they would be back. Just not tonight. I had always felt safe in my apartment. It wasn't in the best part of town, but it wasn't in the worst either. It was quiet most of the time, except for the occasional sound of traffic or people walking by outside. I lived alone, which I loved. There was something peaceful about the solitude, but all of that changed one night. It was a Friday, and I had just finished binge-watching a series on Netflix. It was around 11:30 p.m. when I decided to get some sleep. I turned off the TV, set my phone on the nightstand, and crawled into bed. I hadn't been asleep for more than 20 minutes when I heard it. The faint sound of something tapping against my window. At first, I thought it was the wind, or maybe a branch from a tree outside brushing against the glass. But then I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. This time, I was awake enough to feel uneasy. I laid there listening for a few more moments, but I couldn't hear anything else. Maybe it was just my imagination. I rolled over and tried to go back to sleep, but then I heard the unmistakable sound of my door handle rattling. My heart immediately dropped into my stomach. It wasn't a loud rattle, but it was enough to make me sit up, wide-eyed and frozen in place. Who would be trying to get into my apartment at this hour? I couldn't think straight. My mind raced through the possibilities. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe I'd forgotten to lock the door. Maybe I was overreacting. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and sent a quick text to my best friend, asking if she was still up. No response. I tried calling her, but it went straight to voicemail. My pulse quickened. The rattling of the door handle stopped, and everything went eerily quiet. I laid there, staring at the door, waiting. My eyes adjusted to the darkness of the room, and I strained to listen for anything else. I heard nothing, except for the faint sound of my own heartbeat. I reached for the bedside lamp, my hand shaking as I flicked it on. The light didn't make the room feel any less oppressive. I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind. Then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps creaking on the floorboards just outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, my heart racing. I didn't dare make a sound, terrified that whoever was out there would hear me. I grabbed my phone again, but the battery was almost dead. I slowly inched toward the edge of the bed, my eyes glued to the crack under the door, waiting for a shadow to appear. That's when I saw it. Something dark moving, just past the crack. I froze, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body wouldn't move. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and then I heard a whisper, so low it was almost a hiss. "You're awake." The voice was soft, almost playful, but there was nothing playful about it. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just stay here, trapped in my own room. I needed to make a move. I grabbed the lamp from my nightstand and silently swung it toward the door, preparing to defend myself.
I heard the floorboards creak again. The footsteps stopped. Silence. I stood there, waiting for something. Anything. But nothing came. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever, until I finally mustered the courage to move. I quietly stepped toward the door, pressing my back against the wall, holding the lamp like a weapon. Then, without warning, the door slammed open, and I was face to face with a man standing in the doorway, his face partially covered by a mask. He had a knife in his hand, and his eyes locked onto mine like he was trying to figure out what I was going to do next. I didn't have time to think. I swung the lamp with everything I had, hitting him across the face. He stumbled backward, and for a brief moment, I thought I might have had the upper hand. But then he lunged forward, knocking me onto the floor. I kicked and screamed, but his grip was like iron. He held me down, the knife hovering just inches from my face, and whispered again, "Don't scream. It'll be worse for you if you do." I could feel the cold metal of the blade against my skin. My mind raced, trying to find a way out of this nightmare. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sound of sirens wailed in the distance. The man's grip loosened for a split second, just enough for me to wriggle free. I bolted toward the window, throwing it open and crawling out onto the fire escape. I didn't look back. I ran through the alleyways, heart pounding in my chest, until I finally found a street with people around. I called 911, but by the time they arrived, he was gone. The police found no evidence of forced entry, no fingerprints, nothing that linked the man to my apartment. The whole thing felt unreal, like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. But I knew what I'd seen, and I knew that for a brief moment, I had come dangerously close to not making it out alive. I moved out of that apartment the very next week, and to this day, I still can't walk past a dark window without my heart racing. I was home alone on a quiet Thursday night, just watching TV, when I heard a loud bang downstairs. My heart skipped a beat, and I instantly turned off the TV, straining my ears. It wasn't the wind. Someone was definitely in my house. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the cops, but before I could, another noise. A soft thud, followed by the faint sound of muffled voices. It was coming from the living room. My palms were sweaty as I creeped down the stairs, trying to make no noise. I reached the bottom step and froze. Someone was in my house, and they didn't belong there. I could see a shadow dart past the hallway, but I couldn't make out any details. Panic surged through me, but I couldn't move. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Heavy. Someone was coming. I didn't have a weapon. My only choice was to run, but my legs were frozen. The figure appeared at the corner of the living room, a tall man in a mask, his eyes locked on mine, cold and empty. For a moment, we just stared at each other. He took a step closer, and I took a step back, heart pounding in my chest. I bolted toward the front door, but just as my hand touched the handle, it slammed shut. I looked over my shoulder to see him standing there, a grin pulling at his mask. He had locked the door behind me. "You really thought you could run?" he whispered. The words made my blood run cold. I tried the back door, but it was locked too. The house felt like a maze, each door and window another trap. He moved closer, slowly, like a predator toying with its prey. I heard sirens in the distance, a faint sound, but it was enough. His eyes flickered to the window, and in that moment, he seemed to hesitate. "Not yet," he muttered, before backing away and disappearing into the shadows of the house.
I didn't wait to see where he went. I grabbed my phone, hands shaking, and called 911. When the police arrived, there was no sign of the man, no forced entry, no evidence of where he'd gone. It was like he'd vanished. They told me to stay with a neighbor for the night, but I couldn't shake the feeling he was still out there. The next morning, I found a note taped to my front door. "You're next." It was a quiet Tuesday night, and I was home alone. My parents were out of town for the weekend, and I had the house to myself. After a long week, I was finally enjoying some peace, watching a movie and eating snacks, when I heard a knock at the door. At first, I ignored it, thinking it was just some kids messing around. But then, the knock came again, louder this time. I froze. "Hello? Anybody home?" a voice called. I wasn't expecting anyone, and there was no reason for anyone to be knocking at my door at this hour. I tried to ignore it, but the voice persisted. "Come on, I know you're in there." A chill ran down my spine. I wasn't about to open the door, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I peered through the window, but saw nothing. I checked the peephole, still nothing. But then I heard a scraping sound, like someone trying to pry the door open. My heart pounded. I grabbed my phone and texted my parents, asking if they were coming back early. No response. Panicked, I checked every window and locked door. Everything was secure. But just as I started to relax, I heard a loud crash coming from the kitchen. Someone was inside. I grabbed a kitchen knife, my hands trembling. I heard footsteps moving slowly toward the living room, each step growing louder and closer. I dove behind the couch, knife ready. I barely dared to breathe, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped just a few feet away. A voice whispered, cold and low, "I know you're here. You're not getting away." I could feel their presence, standing right above me. Without thinking, I sprang from behind the couch, slashing the knife wildly. The person staggered back, surprised, but I didn't waste any time. I bolted toward the front door and ran into the night. I didn't stop running until I reached my neighbor's house, gasping for air. My neighbor called the police, but when they arrived, there was no sign of anyone inside. No forced entry, no fingerprints. It was as if the intruder had vanished without a trace. But I know what I heard, and I know what almost happened. Whoever was in that house wasn't just after valuables. They were after something else, something far more sinister. It was just me and my sister at home that night. Our parents were out of town, and we had the house to ourselves for the weekend. Everything felt normal until the power went out. It was 11:30 p.m. I was in the living room, scrolling through my phone, when the lights flickered, and then went completely dark. I heard my sister yell from upstairs. "Did you pay the electric bill?" she shouted. "Of course," I called back. "It must be a storm or something." I grabbed my phone, using the flashlight to navigate through the house. The wind was howling outside, and the trees were shaking against the windows. I figured the storm had caused the outage, but the house felt eerily quiet. Too quiet. "Let's just wait for the power to come back," I shouted up the stairs. But then I heard something odd. Footsteps. Slow. Heavy. And they were coming from the floor above. My sister was upstairs, but those weren't her footsteps. These were different. I grabbed my sister's phone and texted her. "Did you hear that?" No reply. I texted again. "Hello?" Still nothing. I started to feel uneasy. I turned on the flashlight and headed up the stairs, my heart racing in my chest. When I reached the top of the stairs, I saw her bedroom door slightly ajar. The footsteps had stopped, but the air felt thick with tension. My sister's door creaked open all the way, but there was no sign of her. I whispered her name. Anna? No answer. Panic crept into my throat. I ran down the hallway, looking into each room, but she wasn't there. I was about to check the bathroom when I heard the faintest noise, something like a shuffling sound, from the attic. The attic. Our house had an old, dusty attic that was barely ever used. I stood there, the flashlight trembling in my hand. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I cautiously made my way to the attic door, located at the end of the hallway. I hesitated, gripping the handle, and then slowly pulled the door open. A gust of cold air hit me in the face, and I nearly stumbled back. But then, something moved, a shadow. I could barely make out the shape of a person crouching by the attic window, their face hidden in the dark. They were breathing heavily. "Anna," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure slowly turned to face me. The face was pale and distorted, with eyes wide and filled with a kind of hollow madness. It wasn't my sister. It was a man. He grinned, a slow, unsettling grin that made my skin crawl. I didn't have time to think. I bolted down the stairs, my heart racing, and grabbed my phone to dial 911. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely unlock it. I was almost to the front door when I heard it. A loud bang, followed by heavy footsteps rushing down the hallway. I turned around, and there he was, standing at the top of the stairs. He was grinning again. That same horrifying grin, his hands gripping the railing. I screamed and ran out the front door. The cold air hit me like a slap, but I didn't care. I ran to the neighbor's house, banging on their door, desperate for help. The police arrived shortly after. They searched the house but found no one. The doors and windows were locked, no sign of forced entry. They checked the attic. Empty. I had to stay with my neighbors that night, too terrified to return home. When our parents got back the next day, they found nothing unusual. But I know what I saw, and my sister. She never came home. The police said she'd been missing for days, but I know the truth. She was taken by that thing in the attic.